What is better than a single Xeon? Well, your answer would probably be 2 Xeons. Well, of course you would be right. I mean, it's always better to have more Xeons. But in today's video, we're going to take a look at the value proposition of going with a setup like this. And that is, in this case, we've got two x5672 Xeons. Now these come in at around $10, and they're a 4-core 8-thread variant of the very popular first generation Westmere Xeons. Now in the past I've covered things like the x5670, the x5650, which is 6-core 12-thread, and they're overclockable, and they represent great value if you can find an overclocking motherboard. However, in today's video, we're going to look at a dual-socketed motherboard where they can accept 2 of these Xeons, and you can put them together and get 8 cores, 16 threads. And at their face value, 8 cores, 16 threads for $20 does sound like fantastic value, but we do have to keep in mind that this is first generation, and the lack of AVX and AVX2 instruction sets, plus in a lot of cases the lack of USB 3 and certain other features, does make this less appealing, especially in 2021. Also, considering its sheer age, there is a lot to talk about if you want to go down this route. And you guys have been requesting that I take a look at the dual first gen Xeons for quite a while. So let's get into it, see what numbers we can pull in games, and then we'll talk about the value proposition right here.
Today's video is sponsored by Cyberghost VPN. They're a world-leading virtual private network provider with over 36 million users. I use Cyberghost VPN to hide my IP address and encrypt my connection, especially if I'm out on a public Wi-Fi network. But it's not just that, Cyberghost VPN is the expert of unblocking geo-restricted content on any country you travel to. Basically, I can watch that movie that is on Netflix USA, but not showing in Australia. Betting on zero. Also, Cyberghost VPN gives you unlimited access to 7,000 servers in 90 countries. They also have apps for all operating systems, and one subscription can protect up to 7 devices at the same time, so you can share it with family and friends. Now's the perfect time to get it because I have an 84% discount for a 3-year plan waiting for you. Click the link in the description and get a complete digital privacy. Links in the description below.
So the first thing you want to do when you get a dual Xeon system like this put together is you're probably going to want to tune the system as best can be tuned, but this is where the problem happens with motherboards like the server grade motherboards. In this case, we're using a super micro motherboard, and you're really limited to not only an older kind of BIOS where it's not even UEFI, but you've got the only option here is really to overclock the memory. In this case, we put it on 1333 megahertz, which is, we're using DDR3 ECC registered memory. And that's one of the big benefits of using these older systems though, is that you can use cheaper memory that wouldn't work on consumer grade boards. Say for instance, a H61 motherboard just won't support DDR3 ECC registered memory, but we're locking this 1333 megahertz speed, as well as dropping the QPI frequency down here to 4.8. And the reason we're doing that is to take some of the heat off that North Bridge heatsink. If we're running this higher, then you can overheat this chipset because we're running 2 higher clocked Xeons, because most of these server grade motherboards were only designed to run a lower clocked Xeon, and in turn that would put less strain on the heatsink itself. Though, after we've done those 2 things, we can now get over to Windows and finally run some benchmarks. Now going on into the gaming numbers with our GTX 980, where we recently did the Ryzen 1 3100 build with a GTX 980 as well. And in Fortnite, we do lose out a bit of FPS here to the Ryzen 3 3100, and that's only 4 cores, 8 threads. So this is more limited to the single threaded side in Fortnite, believe it or not, and this is causing us to lose a bit of FPS, though it's nothing to be ashamed about getting over 100 FPS, and this is on competitive settings with the epic view distance and low settings. So this plays really well on this PC still. It's just, of course, you will be losing a bit of FPS if you're not going with a newer CPU with better single thread performance, or of course, you're not overclocking the CPU. In this case, we can't. However, let's move over now to CSGO, where the FPS here was surprisingly a lot better than it was in Fortnite, where in the previous video when we did the Ryzen 3 3100, we actually tested the same map and we used the same settings, and we're getting very similar FPS on this dual Xeon x5672 setup. So that is some good news, scoring over 150 average FPS. Though one thing I will note is that the 1% and 0.1% lows, especially on this PC in particular, they aren't that accurate, in that as soon as we hit the F5 key to start benchmarking in pretty much any title that we tested here today, the 1% and 0.1% lows drop really low. But after that, the 1% lows do tend to pick up a little bit, and it is relatively, at least in CSGO and Fortnite, for what it's worth, a smooth experience. Then moving over now to Call of Duty Cold War Black Ops. This is playing this game at 1080p, 100% render resolution, and it's on a blend of low and medium settings. The game itself this time around configured the settings automatically, and when I started playing it on these settings, it actually gave us around 70 FPS. I mean, changing some graphics settings around and lowering them down, you might be able to get a bit more FPS, squeeze a little bit more out of this thing, but for what it's worth, I was really impressed with the visual quality for what we're getting on this game at 1080p. And of course, it was very playable on these CPUs, the 8 cores, 16 threads. What we can see is, at least in the 3 titles so far, and then actually the next title is just gonna be just as bad, that the 16 threads isn't being perfectly utilized. I believe if we were utilizing that a bit better, then we could get some higher FPS. Though, on to Cyberpunk. This game, scoring around 40 average FPS, just like it did on the Ryzen 3 3100 setup. This is pretty much GPU bound, Cyberpunk being one of the worst games in terms of its graphics demand, and that it's just so hungry for the GPU power. And in this case, the GTX 980 can deliver it at 1080p low settings, but if that is something that you want to just step outside and do some jumping jacks to, then by all means, please go do some jumping jacks. But 40 FPS, it's a little bit under. I do like to get 60 FPS or more if I can, even if I'm changing the settings to not so desirable graphic fidelity or low. But in this case, we've already pretty much lowered the settings as low as they can go. So good old Cyberpunk still running pretty poorly, even on mediocre rigs. Like, we're not even going into that potato level, and this thing still can't put out the FPS. So we've now just finished up our Cinebench benchmark here in R23, and the Dual Xeon scored 5,618 points. This will make for surprisingly a decent 1080p video editing rig, especially since we do have 24 gigabytes of RAM installed in this PC. Though, after running that Cinebench score, you're probably wondering, like, what's the go here? That looked pretty good, especially for the price. And yes, it is pretty good for that price, but one thing to keep in mind is that we've had to install a fan here over that heatsink, which is pretty much because we're running 2 CPUs right now. This heatsink does get very hot, and because it's a server kind of build, we do want to make sure we've got this fan cooling that heatsink, because if we don't, it can actually overheat and turn the system off, and that's not good, especially while you're gaming or doing productivity tasks. You don't want this to happen. I believe this is the reason why a lot of people do send. This is the 3rd x58 server motherboard people have sent into me here, where one of them I had to wash, and 2 others, I guess people just tried using them and they just didn't work properly for them. And in this case, we've got this working where it's working properly with a fan directly flowing air over the Northbridge heatsink right here, which is sort of right under the graphics card. So in a difficult location, but you can get the job done and you will get some very good performance, as we're seeing here with the Cinebench score. Now, in terms of power consumption, that is a bit of a minus on a setup like this, where I'll show you guys the idle power consumption numbers as well as the power consumption numbers while we're running Cinebench and also while we're gaming in Call of Duty. So now, coming back to the talking head, what we can see with those results is that yes, this thing can still play games in 2021. And in fact, if you find something like this on a local deals hunt, or you find a server motherboard for very cheap and no one wants to use that thing anymore, like for instance, I got a server rack given to me in a parts hunt and I utilized that to get some very good price performance. If you can get something like that where it's a local deal or someone just sells it off for a ridiculously low price, then of course you can get some amazing price performance. Never look past the used market for getting a good deal. But what we're going to look at right now is, of course, the market rates online, which is a very important part. And the 2 Xeons themselves, by themselves, $10. I think that's always going to be a good option for someone, especially who just wants to play, say, CSGO, Fortnite, a bit of League of Legends. But when we look at the 2 of these, in the fact that we've got to put them on an expensive motherboard, where the prices that I checked for these motherboards are around $100 each. So if we've got the $100 motherboard, then we've got the 2 coolers that we've got to put on top, which are $20 each. Then we've got the 2 CPUs. This now brings us to around 140 USD. And honestly, at this price, I would recommend some other choices, and that's either going with 1st generation Ryzen, or of course going with one of my very popular favorites right now, and that is the X99 Xeons off AliExpress. My favorite being the 2678 V3, that's a 12 core 24 thread. That will set you back a little bit more dollars in the grand scheme of things. But if we look at the 8-core, for example, you can pick these up very cheap and get a motherboard as well as RAM and fit that out for pretty much the same price as this. And that will give you 8 cores, 16 threads. And not only that, you'll have AVX and AVX2 instruction sets on top of that. And since using the North Bridge configuration on these chipsets, they then had higher multipliers on the CPUs, even in idle. And of course, 45 and 32 nanometer chips aren't as efficient as their smaller brethren. Though the final obstacles, as I would call it, with a setup like this, is that you do need 2 CPU coolers. So you will be spending extra money on coolers, and also you might need an EATX case, which could set you back more money. And of course, the fact that you've got to remove more heat from the case than you traditionally otherwise would, so you might need more case fans, and of course, a bigger power supply, because you now got to feed 2 CPUs power as opposed to 1. So in this case, we did get away with using a 650 watt power supply. It was absolutely fine. But say for instance, we wanted to step it up to 2 6-core 12-threaded Xeons to make 12 cores, 24 threads in total, then I'd suggest going with an even bigger power supply, especially if we're using a more power-hungry GPU like a 980 Ti, for example. Though, when all the dust is settled and the sun is shining down brightly on these first-generation Xeons, it doesn't take away from the fact that these things can still play games. And if you do pick them up cheap enough, and you do have a bit of time on your hands, and you do have some of the parts lying around to fix yourself up a system, and you just want to play games, then something like this will definitely be able to entertain you even in 2021. Though one more thing not to forget, and I'll say it again like we said in the gaming benchmarks, is if you do go with a setup with 2 CPUs, in this case, especially if it's first generation, do put a fan over that chipset heatsink, because it did in this case overheat without that fan, and I have used a setup like this in the past, and it has overheated without the fan as well. So would definitely recommend getting that fan over there. But other than that, I'm pretty happy with this PC. It's not loud at all, and it does get up and boogie still. And I think that's the most important thing. Anyways, with that aside, if you guys enjoyed today's video, then be sure to hit that like button and let us know in the comments section below what you think of going with 2 Xeons like this. Do you share the same thoughts as me? Do you think it's just not an option at all, even if you pick it up cheap enough? Love reading your thoughts and opinions as always, just like this question of the day here, which comes from Tamir Zevedov, and they ask, you're gonna win against whole country governments like Russia. They bought $60 million of GPUs from NVIDIA last week, and many other countries. So to answer this one, it's tricky, right? It comes off the back of the video we did where we spoke about the RTX 3060 and the implementation of what NVIDIA is doing with the algorithms to essentially nerf or drop the hashing rates of the RTX 3060 to make it less desirable for cryptocurrency miners. Now, Russia buying up $60 million worth of GPUs in a week, I mean, that's what a lot of corporations are doing. They're just buying up all these graphics cards and making money. And that's what cryptocurrencies introduced. It's introduced this new wave of demand because people want to make profit. And of course, the RTX 30 series, especially the 3060 Ti, being the most desirable in terms of power efficiency versus profit, they're going to be wanting to buy them up. So we've got this extra demand coming in. One thing I know is that the hashing rate and the profitability of a 3060 at its current price point versus a 3060 Ti is a lot less desirable for miners. But when we look at the difference in gaming numbers, it's a lot less than that difference in cryptocurrency hashing rates. So that's definitely going to help gamers in that sense. And lastly, one thing to say about this whole situation, a lot of people are criticizing NVIDIA now for doing this. And look, I know, like, don't get me wrong, I'm the first guy that will tell you, and I've been telling people this for years, these are corporations, they don't care about you. But one thing I will say is they do care about your business, and business from gamers is continual, as opposed to cryptocurrency miners, which isn't. NVIDIA knows that. So they're gonna want to try to take care of the gamers before the cryptocurrency miners. And so I feel like what they've done with this 3060 drop in hashing rates is actually a good thing. Though at the end of the day, it's a very touchy subject, and the fact that people are getting very emotional about it and they're getting heated up in the comments means there is a lot of frustration around this subject. And I feel like the cryptocurrency thing in general is not, it's one of those things that's not solving anything in the world at all. It's just creating more problems than it's fixing. That's what I feel like cryptocurrency is doing. And of course, the most important thing is I feel like cryptocurrency, and especially the speculation going into it, is definitely a band-aid from all the governments going crazy on the printer. And of course, I feel like it's a band-aid for the real problem, and that's the government's just printing out money like rates that they've never done before. So all this mayhem that we're seeing, I feel like there's a better solution at the core, and I feel like you've got to fix the core problem rather than try to band-aid it. Good question of the day. Thanks for that one. Anyway guys, if you stayed this far and you're enjoying that Tech Yes content, I'm going to be getting it back onto Xeons and used parts hunts and more positive stuff, because this whole crypto situation, when I talk about it, it does just bring me down. It's nothing to be positive about, I think. Anyway, if you stayed this far and you're enjoying that Tech Yes content, be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell, and I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.